Welcome back to Scary Interesting and to another collection of horrible fates. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories of people who had something horrifying happen to them when they were extremely isolated. 2 of these happened deep in the mountains and the final was at the South Pole. And as a result of them being in such remote locations, we can only speculate about what really happened. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In 2006, a man, his wife, and their son were in an area by what is known as the Pinnacle Lake Trail in Washington. This is northeast of Seattle, fairly deep into the mountains in the Mount Baker National Forest. And if you know anything about the area, this is like the quintessential Pacific Northwest. The only area where you get even more of the stereotype is by heading west toward Olympic National Park. So it's got all the things the area is known for: the temperate rainforest, the massive trees, the dirt logging roads leading up to nowhere in the misty mountains, and the crystal clear mountain lakes. It's just exactly what you might imagine the Pacific Northwest to look like. And a lot of it, as a result of the mountains, is really wild and remote. Depending on the area, you could end up not seeing another person the entire time you were there. But anyways, the family was camping at some spot near the trail and they decided they would go for a hike. So they set off from the campsite down one of the trail offshoots, and it was the dense brush that's typical of July there. It was a bit of a misty day, there was some light rain, and the trees were all covered in the thick moss that the Pacific Northwest is famous for. As they walked, they saw a pond in the distance on another offshoot of the trail. It looked interesting, so they decided to go toward it. So they start down the offshoot toward the pond, and they're hopping over logs and ducking under others, but then at one point the wife stops. She then blurted out, "We need to leave now." The husband then asked her what was wrong, and she replied that she suddenly got this really bad, really uneasy feeling. And this wasn't about her feeling bad, it was like there was something bad there or nearby. The husband at this point wasn't really sure what to make of this, but there was something about the seriousness of her tone that really made it seem like a legitimate threat. He also knew her intuition had been helpful before, so he just said, "Okay, let's head back then." They could just easily go somewhere else, and at the very least, she'd feel better. So they backtracked from the pond and then back to their campsite, and for the rest of their stay, nothing out of the ordinary happened. They stayed the night and then left the following evening and made the drive back to their home. Once they were home, they unpacked, popped on the TV, and at some point put on the news. As it would turn out, there was a story breaking about basically the area they were just in. To the horror of the family, 2 women were found dead 2 miles up the very same trail they were on. On July 11th, which was the day the family packed up and left, 56-year-old Mary and her 27-year-old daughter Susanna planned to hike Mount Pilchuck. They got to the trailhead and started hiking, but found there was still a ton of snow on the trail. In that area, the rain it's known for falls as snow up in the mountains in massive quantities. There's often so much that it stays well into the summer in some areas. They didn't quite have the equipment or didn't feel like dealing with the snow, so they decided to do the Pinnacle Lake Trail instead. A little while later, they got to the trailhead, and by this point, the only people they had told were some hikers they had passed, either on the Pilchuck Trail or at the Pinnacle Trailhead through small talk. Then, several hours later that same day, other hikers in the area stumbled upon their bodies, each with a single gunshot wound to the head. Those hikers then immediately made their way down and called the police to report what they had found. An investigation then began immediately, but despite decades since this occurred, there have been no leads. There were no signs of robbery, assault, and no other witnesses. The only things found at the scene were a partial DNA sample that hasn't been able to be matched and the 2 shell casings. Police also seem to have cleared the hikers they interacted with that day who they had told their plans to. The husband of the mother and daughter got home after 9 p.m. that day, and his wife and daughter still weren't home. This wasn't like them, and he knew he needed to go looking for them, and then shortly after that, detectives arrived to tell him the tragic news. In the 19 years since, nothing has come of the investigation, so taken all together, it's believed that this was an ambush by someone waiting in the forest or possibly following them. To make this all even creepier, the day this occurred, the woman and her family were still camping nearby and could have even possibly heard the gunshots. And then to top it all off, she had that terrible feeling just the day before. This begs the question, is it possible that whoever it was that did this was nearby when she got that feeling? Either way, they're probably extremely grateful they turned back when they did. In late February of 1939, Alaskan trapper Chris Colby set out from his home in Ketchikan on the Alaskan Panhandle to his annual hunting grounds on Prince of Wales Island about 50 miles to the east. At the time, he was in his early 40s and he was physically fit, savvy, and about as experienced as any trapper in the region. He'd set a number of traps the previous year, and after a few months, it was time to head back and collect the animals and harvest their pelts before the spring thaw. Colby had been trapping and hunting along Thorn Bay and the Thorn River on the island for years, and this area is incredibly wild, rugged, and mountainous. The whole Alaskan panhandle is sparsely populated, and even despite its proximity to British Columbia, there are very few people. As a result, the area he went to was only ever visited by die-hard trappers and outdoorsmen. The island itself is also a mix of lakes, streams, creeks, rivers, and forests, all of which are inhabited by animals with valuable pelts like beaver, otter, and mink. There were plenty of dangerous predators like wolves and bears too, but Colby had never had any serious run-ins with them. He arrived at Hansen Cabin at the end of February or early March, which had been built decades before, and Colby had spent a lot of time there over the years. Other hunters and trappers occasionally used it too, but he always had it to himself during the late winter when he returned to the island to collect his pelts. Like he always did, he spent the first day unpacking his gear and getting settled in. Then, over the following weeks, he'd go over every inch of his trap lines, gather his pelts, haul them back, and with a little luck, sell them. Trappers like Colby could make a killing when fur prices were high, and unsurprisingly, there were often conflicts between hunters over this valuable resource. There were even rumors that a few trappers had been killed for their pelts. Obviously, some of these stories may have been embellished or entirely made up, but wary trappers took the threat seriously, and they armed themselves both for hunting and for protection. But despite these potential dangers, Colby always returned with his pelts in late spring or early summer. That year, though, his friends began to worry when he still hadn't showed up in Ketchikan by July. They then took this to the authorities, and they eventually authorized a two-man search party to head out and look for him. The searchers would then reach the area and spend a few days hacking their way through the forest around the cabin, but they never found anything. So eventually, they gathered up some of Colby's belongings and returned to Ketchikan. They also told authorities there was no use sending another search party because the summer foliage was too dense, and even if Colby was dead, scavengers would have devoured his remains. Colby's friends and fellow trappers apparently weren't convinced by the searchers. Many didn't think they did more than a casual search before returning, so to get to the bottom of the matter, a friend named W.A. Selfridge organized a second official search party that set out for Prince of Wales Island in October of 1939. This was about 8 months after Colby was last seen. Selfridge and the other searchers took enough food and gear to last about a month, and Selfridge was nearly as familiar with the area around the Thorn River as Colby had been. When they got to the island, the weather couldn't have been worse as they climbed into their boat and began the painstaking process of poling their way up the Thorn River. This is similar to what you see in Venice, where a person stands in a boat and pushes with a long pole to move forward. Also, the rain in this area is notoriously unrelenting, especially in the fall and winter, and they were battered by torrential rain nearly every step of the way. By the time the men made it to Hansen Cabin, the men were exhausted, starving, and soaked to the bone. The cabin was in remarkably good condition by Alaskan wilderness standards, but they did note what appeared to be a fresh bullet hole in one of the outside walls. Colby had obviously been there because his gear was spread all over the place, but other than that, there were no signs of struggle, let alone a murder, and it didn't look like anything of value had been taken. The men did find it odd that there weren't any pelts in and around the cabin like there would have been if Colby had tended to his trap lines, but on the other hand, it wasn't even clear how long he'd been there. Selfridge then noticed that Colby had made a mark on the calendar in the cabin on March 2nd. By the looks of it, he headed out to the bush on the 2nd or the 3rd with only enough food and gear to sustain him for a day or two, and for whatever reason he never returned. While the others unloaded the gear and prepared the cabin for a long stay, Selfridge trekked out into the bush and shot a big deer. Then, after a good meal and a good night's sleep, the men spent the next several days scouring the area on foot and by boat. Again, the air was rough, rugged, and in some places nearly impenetrable, but they continued on, hoping to eventually find Colby. The next few days were relatively uneventful, but on the 6th evening, a man named W.A. Miller was off searching by himself when he found a cluster of tattered clothes and human bones. Nearby, he also discovered a rusty .357 Magnum revolver in a chewed-up leather holster and an old overcoat with a handful of bullets in the pocket. Unfortunately, the remains were so decomposed and strewn about that making a positive identification was impossible. It was dark by the time Miller got back to the cabin and told the others what he found. He said he couldn't tell if the remains belonged to Colby, but whoever it was had obviously been killed and devoured by wolves because there were clear imprints of wolf teeth on the leather holster. They then all woke up early the next morning and trekked to the site to have a closer look. As soon as they got there, another searcher, Victor, immediately recognized the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum and confirmed that it belonged to Colby. Later, Selfridge and the other searchers found another coat with a torn shoulder and sleeve, as well as a sheathed skinning knife with teeth marks on the handle, both of which were near the lake about 100 feet from where the remains were found. In addition, they eventually found 2 arm bones just offshore and about 3 feet of clear water. They still weren't sure exactly how Colby died, but whatever happened, his last few moments must have been horrifying. Back at the cabin that night, Victor cleaned, disassembled, and inspected the .357 and discovered that it had a broken mainspring. This would have prevented it from firing, and this made the implication chilling. Everybody knew Colby was good with a gun, and they just couldn't imagine how a wolf or wolves could get the better of him while he was carrying a weapon. But with the gun broken, that changed everything. Around the fireplace of the cabin over the next few nights, the men mulled over the incident and tried to come up with alternative theories to explain Colby's death. After looking at the evidence from every angle, they concluded that he wasn't the victim of foul play, but instead that he'd been stalked, killed, and eaten by wolves. According to Selfridge, Colby was probably walking across the frozen lake when he realized that he was being followed. It's been speculated that if he was just coming from skinning animals at his traps, he would have had the raw pelts with him. The scent of blood and fresh meat would have then drifted across the flat, frozen lake to wolves in the forest nearby. Once Colby realized he was being pursued, he probably immediately dropped whatever he was carrying to lighten his load and give himself a better chance of getting away. Since neither his pelts or his backpack were found, Selfridge assumed that they simply plunged to the bottom of the lake when the ice melted that spring. Without a functioning gun, Colby's best hope would have been to make it to shore and climb a tree before the wolves overtook him. Based on where everything was found, he probably made it to shore when the lead wolf grabbed him and tore the right shoulder of his coat. This is thought to have slowed him down just enough for the rest of the pack to catch up and join in the attack. Based on the scene, it looked like Colby struck at the wolves with his skinning knife and that he managed to free himself long enough to make it to the base of the tree. But what followed that was too horrific to comprehend, and in the end, most of his remains were found at this very spot. The first-hand account of the incident, written by W.R. Selfridge, appeared in the 1943 edition of Alaskan Sportsman. We'll never know for sure whether wolves killed Colby or just consumed his body after he was already dead. I think we can all agree, though, that hopefully it wasn't the theory put forth by Selfridge. If it were, it would make it one of the only deaths by wolf attack in North American history. Leonid Rogozov was born in a remote corner of eastern Siberia in the spring of 1934. By then, the Russian Revolution had been over for more than a decade, but times were just as tough, if not tougher, than they'd been under the Tsars. Like most villagers of the region, Leonid's family barely managed to survive the conditions, and sadly, the situation got even worse when his father died fighting in World War II in 1943. Leonid was only 11 years old at the time, but he promised himself that he wouldn't spend the rest of his life as a penniless peasant in Siberia. And thankfully, he was a bright child and an exceptional student. In 1953, he was accepted to study at the prestigious Pediatric Medical Institute in Leningrad. Afterward, he spent a few months working at a clinic in St. Petersburg that catered to children from poor and working-class families. The work there was way more fulfilling and rewarding than he thought it would be, and he eventually decided to enroll in a grueling clinical training program for aspiring surgeons. In the mid-1960s, a fellow physician suggested that he put his training on hold and join the 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition that was scheduled to depart in early November. Leonid wasn't sure if spending 2 years in a frozen wasteland would be good for his career or his mental and physical health, but like everyone else in the time period, he got swept up in the aura of adventure and romanticism that surrounded the expedition. And to his surprise, he got hired on as the expedition's physician, despite being a relatively inexperienced 26-year-old general practitioner. The 91,000-mile journey took 5 weeks afterward, and then, when the Ob disappeared over the horizon, leaving Leonid and his colleagues in Antarctica, they knew they'd be on their own in the unbelievably harsh and desolate wasteland for nearly 2 full years. This was a daunting prospect to say the least, but at the beginning they were all brimming with enthusiasm. This would lead to them being so productive in the early going that the base was nearly finished by mid-February of 1961. This meant they had 20 months to kill before the Ob would return to get them. Many scientists there still had work and observations to make, and Leonid helped out whenever he could, but in the absence of major illnesses and injuries to deal with, he became increasingly bored, frustrated, and homesick. He wrote in his journal nearly every day and did anything he could think of to occupy himself, but despite his best efforts, his mental condition deteriorated with each passing day. In one journal entry, he described his worsening condition as, quote, waves of dull homesickness that were exacerbated by an increasing hatred for what he described as cursed Antarctica. What he wanted more than anything was to get back to his patients at the clinic in St. Petersburg. In hindsight, he realized that he got exponentially more satisfaction serving them than he did measuring snowdrifts and making dull meteorological observations. Soon enough, Leonid's increasingly gloomy demeanor ultimately led to depression, anxiety, and exhaustion. In fact, he was so tired and feverish on the morning of Saturday, April 29, 1961, that he couldn't even get out of bed. As the morning dragged on, he began experiencing general joint and muscle soreness, waves of nausea, and then acute pain in the lower right-hand side of his abdomen. Then he realized this was maybe unrelated to the homesickness he'd been feeling. Soon enough, he was pretty sure that he was actually suffering from acute appendicitis. After all, he was familiar with these symptoms because he diagnosed the condition and performed numerous appendectomies over the years. Even in the early 1960s, though, they were about as risky as run-of-the-mill tonsillectomies. At least they were in modern cities like St. Petersburg. If Leonid had been back in the Soviet Union, he would have erred on the side of caution and had his appendix removed. But that wasn't possible at a remote Antarctic research station. And in that type of environment, he knew that an untreated case of appendicitis could be a death sentence. Appendicitis can sometimes go away on its own, but this is extremely rare. And by the second or third afternoon, he concluded that sitting idly by and hoping for the best was no longer an option. He clearly needed an emergency appendectomy as soon as possible, but the nearest Soviet research station was more than 1,000 miles away. Other countries had closer bases, but nobody had an aircraft available for a last-minute medical evacuation. And even if they did, the plane wouldn't have been able to land because Leonid's medical emergency just so happened to coincide with a blizzard that was epic even by Antarctic standards. It didn't take Leonid long to realize that help wasn't on the way and that he'd have to perform his own appendectomy. It was only a matter of time before his swollen appendix burst, and when it did, he'd probably be dead within a minute or two. So instead, he'd have to cut open his own abdomen, displace his intestines, remove the infected organ, and stitch himself back up without fainting or giving himself a lethal case of sepsis. Shortly thereafter, Leonid began preparing a surgical plan, setting up the makeshift OR, and selecting and training the researchers who'd act as his assistants. After careful consideration, he settled on a driver and a meteorologist because he thought they were the least likely to pass out from the sight of blood and guts. The following day, he taught them how to administer adrenaline, perform CPR in case he lost consciousness during the operation. He also hoped to get good sleep on the night of Sunday, May 31st, 1961, because he'd need every possible ounce of energy to get through the operation that was scheduled to begin the following afternoon. But by then, the pain in his abdomen was so excruciating that he couldn't nod off for more than a minute or two. His condition was even worse the following morning, and he wrote in his diary that the gale force winds outside sounded like 100 angry jackals howling in unison. At approximately 2 p.m. on Monday, June 1st, 1961, Leonid eased himself into a semi-reclining position on his left side. He knew he was about to experience unfathomable pain. He couldn't rely on general anesthetic because he had to have an absolutely clear mind, so all he had was some Novocaine around the cutting site. The question was, would he be able to deal with it until the operation was over? At that point, he was admittedly terrified. One of his assistants then handed him a scalpel while the other held a mirror over the cutting area. Then, without further delay, Leonid began the process of slicing through his outer layer of skin before making an even more excruciating 4-inch incision in his abdominal wall. Afterward, he was shaking so badly that he had to take a few moments to regain his composure. His assistants' faces and bodies were largely obscured because they were wearing masks and full-length medical robes, but even so, he couldn't help but notice that their exposed skin was far wider than normal and they couldn't hide the terror in their eyes no matter how hard they tried. The original plan was to conduct the rest of the procedure using the mirror for visual assistance. However, the assistant's shaky hand and the inverted image became so distracting that Leonid decided to continue using only a sense of touch. By then, he was also suffering from intense nausea, and by the time he located his appendix under his intestines, he was doing his best to keep from passing out. He was also bleeding more than expected, and just when it seemed like things couldn't possibly get any worse, he inadvertently cut a large gash between his large and small intestines. When he looked in the mirror to see how bad the damage was, he immediately knew he'd have to stop and stitch it up before continuing on. This was horrific because it meant even more blood loss, more pain, and more time under the knife. But nonetheless, he managed to stitch up the wound and locate his appendix. Once he felt it, he used the mirror to verify its location and condition. This is when he realized his appendix was swollen and deformed, and the base had taken on a sickly blackish purple hue. This was clear proof that the organ could burst at any moment, but from there, the operation went off without another major hitch. Incredibly, Leonid removed the appendix, applied antibiotics directly into the cavity, and stitched up his abdomen before collapsing, sweat-drenched, nearly 2 hours after making the first cut. Leonid was in and out of consciousness and experienced severe fever and abdominal inflammation over the next few days, but his condition steadily improved and he reported feeling almost entirely normal by the 5-day mark. He even removed the abdominal stitches a few days later, and the following week he even climbed out of bed and resumed his normal duties at the station. Leonid and the researchers were evacuated by a single-engine aircraft shortly after the blizzard subsided. He received a hero's welcome when he finally stepped back onto Soviet soil, and in 1961 he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. Leonid never wanted any of this attention, so he made his way back to St. Petersburg to resume his studies and pick up where he left off at his beloved clinic. After an impressive 4-decade career, he eventually died from cancer in St. Petersburg at the age of 66. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. And a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.